afflicted and devoted herself to every good work, but refused to enroll younger widows, for when they are drawn away from Christ by desire, they may want to marry and will therefore receive condemnation because they have renounced their original pledge. At the same time, they also learn to be idle, going from house to house. They're not only idle, but are also gossips and busybodies, saying things that they shouldn't say. Therefore, I want younger women to marry, have children, manage their households, and give the adversary no opportunity to accuse us. For some have already turned away to follow Satan. If any believing woman has widows in her family, let her help them. Let the church not be burdened, so that it can help widows in genuine need. So there's a lot in there, but we can pretty succinctly summarize that there is this list of widows, which Paul is telling Timothy that he is to set criteria for. And obviously Timothy is aware of what he's talking about. Timothy, having followed Paul in his ministry, likely saw the establishment of this role in the church when he was with Paul, establishing churches wherever he went. The criteria is that this widow who will be on the list must be one who has no family. They can't be provided for by her family. She is one who is truly in need and left all alone, and has put her hope in God and continues night and day in petitions and prayers. She has to be 60 years old. She has to be a woman of one man. And just on that, in the Greek, it is not stating that she has only had one wife, but that she is a woman of one man. So essentially monogamous. So it doesn't mean she can't have been widowed and remarried before. It would be kind of bizarre in light of what Paul has said earlier, that younger widows should remarry, and then after that there's no way that they can serve in this capacity because they're diminished. Doesn't make sense. So they cannot have been adulterous, they cannot have been those who divorced and remarried for wrong motives. That's essentially what he's saying there. That they have to have a reputation for good works, again, having raised children, which doesn't necessarily mean her own children, but one who has contributed to the work of the building up of children and raising of children in family, in the church, etc. So Paul is not here saying that if a woman was barren or was never married, that she doesn't have the capacity to be cared for by the church. In this sense that he's talking. She has to be one who has washed the feet of the saints. She has to have shown hospitality, and she has to have cared for the afflicted in her life. So a servant, one who has a servant heart, one who has not been given to great unfaithfulness in relationship, and also that one of these women is devoting themselves to celibacy in service to God. We balk at that in the Protestant church, but it's hard not to see that that is what Paul is saying here. That there is a commitment being made not to remarry and to devote themselves wholeheartedly to the service of God, to devote themselves entirely to prayer and petition day and night as their work. Which is why he's saying women under 60, you can't do this. Go and get married or wait until such time as you're past the stage where you might someday want to marry. Okay? So that's all part of what's being said here. I want to establish that some people will look at this and identify that what he's talking about here is the same as the widows in Acts 6 who were cared for by the distribution of bread. I think this is clearly not the case, because Paul is not here establishing criteria by which a person may be legitimately given charity. That's not what he's talking about here. I mean, if what you're saying is that a woman who was previously divorced with wrong motives cannot receive charity from the church, or a woman who can't be said to have had a life of faithful service and hospitality that, okay, sorry, you're going to have to die in the street. We're not giving you bread. That's not what Paul's talking about. Clearly, he can't mean that. That would go in the face of all of the principles that Jesus' gospel gave us about mercy and love and grace. So that's not it. He's talking about women who are being employed and given honor, which in this context is the provision for all of their needs and a living, and their work is to pray continuously, petition continuously, and serve God, and, of course, to do all of the things that older women are called to do in Titus. So they become full-time ministers of the church, is what Paul is talking about here. Not ministers in the sense, sorry, let me not confuse terms here. They become full-time servants of the church in their prayers and in their, presumably, teaching of other younger women, if they have the strength to do that still. This is what we're seeing here. So, go ahead, Barry.
Oh, no, that's okay. Keep going. I'm just thinking as you're talking.
So this is what is established in the pastoral epistles as the role of women in the church and what Paul has said to Timothy in regards to widows. Now, it's something we don't have women who fit into this category in our world today very often. I mean, who is there in Canada, in our socialist country, that doesn't have the means of provision for themselves? It doesn't have the means by some method of meeting their needs, having a home, even having a car for that matter. So in some sense, we can't directly apply the exact level of need that Paul is talking about here, that somebody would need to be fully provided for by the church because no one else is there. It seems to be that he's saying if somebody is able to be provided for by family, then this doesn't actually apply, but that they should continue in that family and service in that family as well. And so it seems to be a very specific set of criteria by which somebody would meet everything that's here. It's probably something that was met a lot more often in the ancient world, where men's lives were a lot more prone to getting them killed, and women who managed to survive childbirth tended to outlive the men. Nevertheless, here it is. In principle, what I would say is that we can say that it is not contrary to biblical principle to set apart an older woman who has lived through a life of holiness and service, and demonstrated these characteristics, and set her apart as one who is devoted to the ministry of the church when she has no other obligations to family or to her own children or to her parents any longer. Somebody who meets that criteria could faithfully be put into this role in the later years of her life and given the responsibility to devote herself to prayer and to teaching of younger women. All right, any questions about that? Go ahead.
Well, I think it's possible that this is a group of women who are being supported and were then serving the church. I don't think it specifically says that. I think that this truly is a mercy ministry on the part of the church to care for old women who are now, presumably they're serving the church because of the type of women that they were. As they were younger women and they were serving and they were washing the disciples' feet and doing all the things that a good and godly woman does. And then their husbands are gone, there's no family, they have no means of, they're old, so they can't work. 60 years of age was pretty old at that time. And so they're provided for by the church. And the church is burdened by that. That's why it says that if you have family members, you should take care of the widows so the church is not burdened. But I don't think it specifically says that these women were set apart for service to the church. I would presume that they were doing that because of the type of women that they were. But does it specifically say that? Maybe I'm not seeing something there.
The widow who is truly in need and left all alone has put her hope in God and continues night and day in petitions and prayer is the woman who meets the criteria. Someone who is in perpetual work of prayer and petition. Now, okay. So, somebody who is on this list is to meet that criteria. So, what I'm saying is that this is not simply a mercy ministry, which I think you agree with, because to suggest that would be suggesting that we deny charity to women who don't meet this criteria, which...
Yeah, there's a clear distinction, for sure. Yeah.
So this is a different level of support and care, and there's a different expectation of the ministry that woman is going to do inside the body of Christ, as a member of the body of Christ. And I think that's probably fair.
Yeah.
So, having said that, we have older women. Older women are called, all of them, including these ones that we're talking about here, who are also clearly older women, to teach younger women how to live lives of holiness. There is something about these widows who are not being able to be cared for by family or anyone else that are now under the care of the church, that they are set apart. And they're set apart by a vow of chastity, seemingly, as what Paul is saying here, to devote themselves wholly to a life of pursuing God. That's hard to get around in the text. So that's there. And then there's the doctrine of deaconesses or female deacons, which often tries to tie all of these things together. And I want to say, as we talked about it last week, it is an ancient doctrine. It's one that many in the early church espoused, that female deacons were never universally in the church practice, but from the beginning they were there. And there were some who supported that and some who didn't amongst the church fathers. So it is very early. I want to present to you very quickly what the biblical arguments for and against are, and then we'll close that whole dialogue with, I hope, a valid exhortation. So those who advocate for female deacons generally will look at 1 Timothy 3:11, which we looked at last week. It's in the midst of the definition for deacons. It says, "Their wives likewise must be dignified, not slanderers, but sober-minded, faithful in all things." Now the word "their wives" is a single word in the Greek. It just means women. It doesn't have the possessive attached to it in that context, so it can be translated as women deacons must be dignified, not slanderers, sober-minded, faithful in all things. It may also be translated as the wives of deacons must be these things. And both are perfectly legitimate translations of what's presented in the Greek text. So we have to, and I'll say that Greek scholars much wiser than I have stated both are valid interpretations. I'm not speaking from my own wisdom here. So we have to understand more broadly whether or not that's a sensible interpretation. Just because it's grammatically possible doesn't make it a reasonable interpretation of the text. So the question is there any evidence that this would point to female deacons in the scriptural context that we have? The argument generally is used that in the text itself, there is a peculiarity where women are singled out in the role of deacon, but not in the role of elder. So why are deacons' wives having more responsibilities than the elders' wives? The answer to that from the other position would be, well, because the deacons' wives are expected to be in service with the deacons. Because a deacon who is given to the service of the church and is actually satisfying the biblical principles for the diaconate is going to be meeting with those in need. He's going to be providing for visitation. He's going to be providing for the material concerns of the poor. And he's going to potentially come into situations where there are single women that need to be cared for, and his wife can do that or be present in any situation where he would be doing those works. That would be the explanation for why that is more pronounced for the deacon than the elder, because the elder's wife is not, although she's fundamental to the work that the elder does by supporting him and standing with him, she's not going to get into the pulpit, and she's not going to lead the church. She's not going to participate in that ministry, whereas the deacon's wife is going to participate in his ministry of service. So that's dealing with the internal argument there, the two positions there. It's said that if you look at Romans 16:1, there is a passage referring to Phoebe, and it says, "I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a servant, a diaconon, of the church at Cenchrea, that you may welcome her in the Lord in a way worthy of the saints, and help her in whatever she may need for you, for she has been a patron of men and of myself as well." Now they'll say, well, that says she's a deacon of the church at Cenchrea. And it does. It's the exact same word that is being used in 1 Timothy to describe the deacon who is being appointed by these qualifications as a servant in the church. And that is a reasonable thing to say, and it's not an unreasonable interpretation of what's said there. But the problem with that is that diaconon is used 29 times in the New Testament. There are only 3 times it's used specifically and unequivocally of the office of deacon. It's Philippians 1:1, which is written to elders and deacons, and the 2 references here in 1 Timothy. There are 2 other uses of the same word in Romans. One is that when you see in Romans 13, it says, "For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear to the one who is in authority, and do what is good, and you will receive his approval, for he is God's servant, diaconon, for your good." So we assume that the king is not being said here to be a deacon of God in the church, but it's being used in the general sense that he's a servant. In Romans 15:8-9, it actually uses the same word when it says, "For I tell you that Christ became a diaconon, servant to the circumcised, to show God's truthfulness." Well, it's not saying Jesus was a deacon in the church, holding the office of deacon. It's saying that he was generally a servant to the circumcised to show God's truthfulness in order to confirm the promises given to the patriarchs and in order that the Gentiles might glorify God for his mercy. So it's a moot point, is what I'm saying. Phoebe clearly was a woman who was a servant of the church in the general sense. The term generally definitely applies to her because Paul specifically states that she's been providing for his ministry and the ministry of many others. Paul also says, when he's writing that they are to receive her, right? And they're to receive her well, which means most understand what he's saying there is that Phoebe herself is carrying the letter to them, that she has come with whatever group is carrying this letter. So it's also, as you read there, that Phoebe is to be provided for by the church at Rome, and that they are to give her whatever assistance she may require as she goes onwards, indicating that probably she's going further to carry Paul's letters with those who are carrying the letters and to bring them to the other churches. So she is a servant of the gospel of the church. She's a servant in her provision, and she's a servant as one who is bringing messages to the people and not sharing the gospel from the pulpit, but sharing the gospel as it is being brought forth. She's providing for the expansion of the kingdom. So yes, she's a servant in the general sense of servant. It doesn't mean anything. So what do we make of all that? Well, what I would make of it is that the history in the church is so confused as to be of no value whatsoever in discerning which position is credible. And exegeting the text really does allow for either position, provided that you understand a female deacon's role to be that of a servant, like one who serves the material needs of women and satisfies more directly the service of women in the manner that is given in Titus, and serving the material needs of the church as Phoebe did in providing for the gospel and in dealing with material responsibilities for the church, then you don't have a conflict there with the fact that women are not to teach or have authority over men in the church. So if that is the tradition, which many Reformed churches hold, of having female deacons in that kind of a role, and this the Baptist Church has held in the past here, then fine. I don't think there's an objection biblically to doing that, as long as you keep it out of the role of elder, which we so creepingly tend to do in our churches. But the Bible also doesn't necessitate that in any way, and I don't think that we need to do that to satisfy what is being taught to us here. What we do need is we need women to fulfill the responsibilities to teach other women and to build them up in lives of holiness, to be involved intentionally in the lives of young women, to guide them into the path of righteousness so that they know how to raise their kids, know how to love their husbands, know how to live as single women when they're living as single women in holiness and in obedience to God and resisting temptation, that they know how to live out holy lives because there is a mentor who's standing with them and guiding them in those things. That is necessary. It's a long way around to say it, maybe. I'm going to stand on my conviction that I don't think it's anti-biblical to have female deacons, provided it is in the right constrained context and that it's not violating any of the principles of leadership or authority. But I don't think we require that to fulfill what is said in Scripture. So I hope I didn't terribly confuse everyone. Older women, minister to younger women. Let's get her going on. Questions before we go to prayer?
So within your framework, would you have a deaconess whose husband was not a deacon?
Within my framework, I would say that those churches which have established that in their tradition, that women in a specific deaconess role could be single widows, and I don't think that would be a violation of the principle, but I don't see a married woman fulfilling that responsibility while her husband isn't. No.
Because how's she going to ask at home?
I find it interesting. I mean, I have no problem with the idea, and I don't think it's anti-biblical with having specific women or group of women who are identified as godly women to serve in different ways in the church. I totally agree with that. But I think it's important to note, in 1 Timothy 3, when you have the qualifications for elders and the qualifications for deacons, that the Greek word translated woman, which as you noted, is either wife or woman depending on the context, but it's the same word, that is used 3 times in 1 Timothy 3. The first time it's used, it's with reference to the elder. He says he has to be the husband of one wife. Literally, it means a one-woman man, in literal translation. The second time it's used is with reference to women in the context of deacons, where it says their wives. ESV obviously translates it in the way they interpret it, but their wives or their women, likewise, must be dignified, not slanderous, but sober-minded, faithful in all things. The problem I have with interpreting that as referring to female deacons, I'm going to avoid deaconess because it's in the male form, but the problem I have with it being women as deacons is because the third time the word woman is used is immediately after that statement in verse 12, when it says, let deacons each be a one-woman man. It doesn't make any sense to me. Like, when he's talking about women, why would he say that deacons should be not only a one-woman man, but in the case of a female deacon, you need to be a one-man woman? He doesn't do that. It just doesn't make any sense that he's talking about male deacons and their qualifications, and he kind of throws this one statement about women, and then he goes back and immediately says that deacons need to be the husband of one wife or a one-woman man. So I'm not convinced that this refers to female deacons. I think that the weight of evidence, and I understand there's lots of men who know a lot more than I do that disagree with me, but I think the weight of evidence would support the idea of a wife. But that being said, I think that the rest of Scripture, when you bring it all together, the idea of having a group of women as servants, I prefer to use a word like that rather than deacons just for the sake of confusion. Like you used the word minister earlier and corrected it just because of confusion. So I think it supports that, but I'm not convinced that the qualifications for deacons here support the idea of female deacons, personally. I'd say that.
Well, we should